Greetings. I'm Randall Carlson, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of Squaring the Circle podcast, where we dive into all kinds of areas of interest that I think could be important in plotting out a successful future. One of the things that I think is a very important part in the history of the last couple thousand years is this so-called Dark Ages or Dark Age that occurred just prior to the rise of classical medieval civilization, the Persian Empire, so on. It lasted from about the mid 500s to about the mid 900s. And then it was replaced by a warming of the world called the medieval warming period. Now, many people think that the Dark Ages is just a metaphor referring to the fact that there was a massive scarcity, if you will, of written records and cultural activity, economic trade. Many of the things that would be undertaken that would show evidence of a very vigorous economy and society. So we have the post-Roman days and the pre-medieval days, which is this kind of in-between area that has been referred to as the Dark Age. So was it just merely a metaphor, or was there actual period of darkness? That's what I want to explore in a couple of episodes of Squaring the Circle, because I think the lessons that we have to derive from that particular extraordinary event are numerous. So let's just get right into it. Since the 1960s and the 1970s, awareness has been growing about major climate shifts occurring during the time that we humans have occupied this planet. More specifically, the realization is dawning that climate change, natural climate change, pre-industrial climate change, has been a major factor in shaping and affecting human history for thousands of years. One example of a profound climate shift in relatively recent times historically happened in the roughly 8 to 10 year period that began around 536 AD. The lessons that this event has to teach us about what has occurred and affected our ancestors in powerful ways are mandatory for modern society to authentically learn to respond to and adapt to sudden climate changes that are due entirely to natural causes. So the focus of this episode is going to be upon that 536 AD event, its aftermath, and its implications for the history that followed in its wake, even down to our own times. It appears possible that in terms of global climatic effects, this episode of environmental change, probably driven by volcanism, at least one of the agencies involved, may be the most severe of all events, climatic events that have affected the course of civilization since at least the 15th century BC. So that's 1,500 years plus 2,000 years, so that's 3,500 years ago. What happened 3,500 years ago was the eruption of Terra, the island volcano which erupted in the eastern Mediterranean and was responsible for the ultimate catastrophic demise of the civilization on the island of Crete, which is going to be a very interesting topic for another episode of Squaring the Circle. So an important new paper was recently published in the journal Boreas this past January in 2025. It provides more evidence for an extraordinary climatic event during the period from 536 to 540 AD. And this time in this new study, the focus was on Sweden, which had previously not been really examined in depth to determine the extent or magnitude of the climatic effects up in Scandinavia. So this study was intended to rectify that. So I'll begin by discussing a report authored by one Irini Anagnostou and Kirsten Leiden with the Archaeological Research Laboratory at Stockholm, working along with John Linderholm with the Environmental Archaeology Laboratory at the University of Umeå, also in Sweden. From this report, which was entitled AD 536/540 Climate Event in Sweden, a Review. From this report, we learn, first in the introductory comments, that, quote, as a result of growing concerns about the impacts of contemporary climate change, research in recent years has shown an interest in exploring the relationship between climatic fluctuations and human responses in the past. The various challenges spanning from climate change, food insecurity, animal extinctions to ecological disaster and societal instability that our planet is facing have led researchers from different disciplines to investigate past human responses to climate change in order to find ways to mitigate the impact of contemporary climate change, unquote. So we find in so many papers now dealing in any aspect or dimension of climate or environmental change or weather are usually prefaced by some endorsement of what is clearly, even though it's not explicitly stated here, is clearly implied to be anthropogenic climate change. So the sticking point here is the use of the term climate change. Do we mean climate change in general, which obviously we must be referring to if we are considering climate change in the pre-industrial era, because we're assuming that in the pre-industrial era we didn't have a major influence on the climate like we do now. Now, of course, the pre-industrial area comprises most of history. Or are we confining the definition of the phrase climate change to only mean change induced in the global climate through the activities of man, specifically humans' use of fossil fuels? Unfortunately, with only a few exceptions, the use of the term climate change in mainstream media refers almost exclusively to the latter. It's humans' fault. The paper that I was citing here came out in Boreas, volume 54, January of 2025. Now, when we proceed to investigate past human responses to climate change, we are necessarily looking at climate change that is predominantly, if not completely, the result of natural forces. Therefore, to address the issue of human responses to changes in climate in the past, we are compelled to consider the full range of climate change variables. We have no choice but to look beyond the limitations of a singular causal process, which, however, as a result of political and economic pressures, now overwhelmingly dominates the public discourse. So, with this in mind, the idea that the conversation, the discussion, the debate about global change, climate change, environmental change, and however you want to describe this change, the overwhelming focus and dominance of the discussion has been on the anthropogenic component of climate change. When we go back into studying the history of climate on Earth, both in the short term and the long term, we discover over and over again, with exceptional redundancy, that there's all kinds of evidence from all fronts that climate has changed naturally and to a very significant degree. So in this Boreas paper, the authors begin by explaining that, and I quote, abrupt climatic alterations have been considered as one of the main driving factors behind societal reorganization, civilization collapses, population declines, and material culture changes around the world. Large explosive volcanic eruptions can, for example, cause significant climate impact because of their substantial sulfur dioxide emissions and the subsequent formation of sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere. These aerosols reflect incoming solar radiation, thereby reducing the amount of sunlight available for primary production at the Earth's surface. A long-lasting cold event caused by multiple severe volcanic eruptions in AD 536 to 540 has been recorded in various historical sources and dendrochronological and ice core data. What is dendrochronological? Well, that's a chronology that's derived from the study of tree rings, which, like ice cores, are layered and can yield up incredible detailed information about the nature of the environment when the tree was growing and when it added that particular layer, that ring of annual growth, or in the layers in the ice core data. So they're kind of similar in a way. Ice core data is usually going to be represented and preserved in layers of ice. Dendrochronological evidence is going to be preserved in layers of tree, of wood. So this event, this 536, 540 AD event, was first recognized by Stothers and Rampino in a paper published in 1983. And the extent of its global impact has been confirmed by high-resolution climatic data. Several studies have considered the AD 536 to 540 event as one of the factors contributing to major socio-political changes, such as settlement abandonments, population declines, migrations, the spread of the Justinian plague, the transformation of the Roman Empire, the invasion of Italy by the Lombards, the rise of the Ottoman Empire, as well as the Arabic Empire, the collapse of the dynasties in China, and the crisis in Mayan society. The event has also been connected to severe famine and economic crisis around the world, owing to crop failure. Less is known about the impact of this event on Scandinavian societies. Unquote. I ask the question, is it possible that such a broad range of phenomena can be connected and triggered by a singular event of outsized effect? Well, the more we learn, the more it becomes apparent that the natural changes of extreme and far-reaching influence have played a critically important central role in driving a wide spectrum of social and cultural change. With regard to this evolving insight, Ananastu and Leiden explain, quote, in Scandinavia, the consideration of climate change as a driving factor for the observed changes in the archaeological record in the middle of the first millennium AD began in the 1950s and the 1960s. And it revived the discussion of climate change and specifically the AD 536-540 event as one of the causes behind the 6th century crisis, and developed the so-called Fimblewinter theory, which influenced several subsequent studies. I will pause and mention in reading this quote that these events that occurred around 536 to 544 AD have been referred to or called, referenced as the 6th century crisis. And then what is the Fimblewinter theory? We'll come back to that in a second. The AD 536 to 540 event in Scandinavia, in Scandinavian research, has been linked to the increased number of gold hoard depositions, different ritual practices, settlement and burial abandonments, demographic decline, famine, and the spread of ergotism and the Justinian plague. I'll back up for a second. I'll say gold hoard depositions. That's interesting because it shows that even almost 1,500 years ago, in times of crisis and social breakdown, people were tending to hoard gold. The other interesting thing here is ergotism, which is a type of a fungus that grows on wheat and rye, various types of grain, when it's subjected to cold and damp. And it can lead to all kinds of crazy behavior in those who are afflicted by it, who eat some of the grain that is contaminated with the ergot. And then also the Justinian plague. We'll talk about that more later. Okay, so that's the end of the quote. So the specifics and the likely triggers of this climatic event are further discussed by the authors. So this is what they have to say. Quote, the period from AD 536 to 545 was the coldest decade of the past 2 millennia, with the year AD 536 being extremely cold. Summer reconstructions from Scandinavia and Finland showed decreased temperatures of around 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade in AD 536 and 540. Bunchen et al. Or others in 2016 suggested that 3 large volcanic eruptions in AD 536, 540, and 547 resulted in a long-lasting cooling from AD 536 all the way up to AD 660. This is referred to. This period is referred to as the late antique Little Ice Age. The late antique Little Ice Age. So it was followed by the worldwide warming that we call the medieval warming period, when the sea ice retracted north, the sea lanes opened up, Scandinavians were able to sail from Britain, Scandinavia to Iceland, and from there to Greenland. And Vikings were able to settle on Greenland and start farming, which they did for the next 300 to 400 years during this period of global warmth. So that was the end of the quote there. The late antique Little Ice Age, followed by the medieval warm period, followed by the Little Ice Age. So to confirm this correlation, the authors of this paper further explain that, and I quote again, the AD 536/540 event had more profound effects than other more recent and well-known volcanic eruptions, such as the Tambora eruption in AD 1815, which caused worldwide crop failure and famine. And I have talked in 2 episodes of Squaring the Circle about that 1815 eruption of the volcano Tambora and the year without a summer. I think it was either episodes 10, 11, or 11, 12. If you go back into the archives, I'd say on Rumble, you'll be able to find those. I would highly recommend rewatching those, or if you've already watched them, or watching them if you haven't, because the information there complements the information I'm presenting you here about the 536 AD event. So it's been considered as one of the factors, together with political and economic conditions, that contributed to societal changes recorded in this period worldwide. The possible effects of this event could be crop failures and famine, and it has been suggested that it contributed to the spread of the Justinian plague and population decline. Helama et al. In 2018 highlighted that not only the cold conditions, but also the reduction in solar radiation could contribute to the outbreak of famine and plague as a result of malnutrition and a deficiency of vitamin D. So we're beginning to see the lines of interconnectedness here. We have some event, now it's proposed that it's a volcanic event, that contributes to the polluting of the atmosphere to the extent that it is reflecting a substantial amount or preventing a substantial amount of solar radiation from penetrating here to the surface, the Earth's surface below, right? So, a couple of things. It produces the cold. It forces a reduce in temperature, which then can lead to crop failures, which then lead to food shortages, that then lead to famine, and famine then can lead to the malnutrition that opens the door to opportunistic diseases and pandemics. At the same time, because of the lack of sunlight, we're now being deprived of vitamin D, which is exactly one of the substances that we need to be keeping our immune system enhanced and resistant to exactly those kind of diseases. So we've got kind of a double whammy at work here, but it begins with whatever this agency is that causes the change in the atmosphere. And let's go on and talk about that some more. So, in summary, substantial evidence exists that supports the occurrence of several large-scale volcanic eruptions between 536 and 540 something AD. What I would ask, could there be more to it? Let's go back to the seminal paper that was referenced by Anagnostou and others that launched a widespread interest in the events around this date of 536 AD in the first place, as well as other abrupt climate changes as well. This paper, published in 1983 in the Journal of Geophysical Research, was authored by two geoscientists, Michael Rampino and Richard B. Stothers, at the time affiliated with the Goddard Institute for Space Studies with NASA. This paper was a culmination of an exhaustively researched phenomena associated with volcanism, that is, volcanic eruptions, especially their role in climate change and the history of civilization. Stothers and Rampino's research looked selectively at a series of volcanic events, beginning with the explosive eruption of the Mediterranean volcano Terra in the 15th century BC, then moving on to Etna, which erupted in 44 BC, and Vesuvius, which erupted multiple times in the years 217 BC, AD 79, and AD 472. From proxy evidence, it was concluded that great eruptions also took place in the years AD 536 and AD 626. One of the things that characterized all the events listed here is that they were followed by a marked veiling and cooling of the atmosphere for at least a year subsequent to the eruptions. In reference to this event, Stothers and Rampino, citing ancient sources, inform us that, quote, 4 historians who were living in the year AD 536 have left surviving accounts of that extraordinary year. So Stothers and Rampino first quote Procopius. He was a late antique Greek scholar and historian who wrote the following in his History of the Wars, quote, "And it came about during this year that a most dread portent took place. For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse. For the beams it shed were not clear, nor such as it is accustomed to shed." Unquote. Another quote was by the Byzantine administrator and writer on matters of antiquity, John Lytus, who in his work entitled On Portents, 9c, wrote that, quote, "The sun became dim for nearly the whole year, so that the fruits were killed at an unseasonable time," unquote. We're taking a little bit of a detour here to tell a story that I think is going to be valuable concerning something that recently happened to me. Oh, and I see I'm being joined by my friend and colleague, Mike Robertson.
Hello, Randall. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Well, regarding this little story we're going to tell, we won't take too long. We'll get back to the episode shortly, but I understand you were in a conference recently in Florida, was it?
Correct, yes, in Florida, in a
And
beautiful hotel, the Fiana Hotel, I believe it was.
excellent.
Yes.
And what something happened there? First of all, how was the conference? But then I
The
understand.
conference was great, and the
Okay.
hotel was awesome, but yeah, everything was good, except I was coming down the stairs, and I think somebody just ahead of me had spilled a little bit of something. Was, you know, crowds moving up and down, and I think somebody spilled a little something on one of the treads in front of me, and my foot hit it.
Mhm.
And slid out from under me, and I tumbled down 3 or 4 stairs to the bottom.
Whoa!
Uh, I survived, as you can see. Look, I'm still here and I'm intact. I
No
didn't
broken
break any
bones.
bones. No broken bones, but I sure banged up my left knee.
Mm.
That was the first thing that hit. My left knee hit that tile floor,
Mm.
and it it was painful, but I had to go. I was actually on my way to do a presentation, so I had to tough it out and go do a presentation
Mm.
with my throbbing left knee. So, anyways, got done with that, and then as the day progressed, it got my knee began to swell up, and it got quite painful, and I was very relieved to remember that I had brought. I happened to pack my CBD from the gods salve, and I was really grateful that I had remembered to do that.
Mm.
So that night I put some of the salve on, went to bed. I regularly applied it before I got dressed, and then I put some more on at night before I went to bed. And I must say, though, being in the construction and building industry, I've had many falls and injuries and stuff, and I figured I'm going to be laid up with this for a month. We drove home. I think it was 3 to 4 days later. I continued applying the salve, and I would say within a week, I was getting around pretty good.
Wow!
Yeah,
Wow!
it definitely helped. It most definitely, and so I understand that there's a lot of healing ingredients in that salve that can actually penetrate in
Mm-hmm.
to a to to really alleviate the inflammation that's inside during an injury like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have all of the specifications for. As a matter of fact, we might actually, in later segments, we might actually interview some of the people from the company who make the product, and they can tell some of the details of, of the ingredients and what they do and how they. Because my understanding is more than just a pain relief. There's actually
Mm,
healing. There's
healing.
compounds and other ingredients in there that literally heal as well as pain relieve pain, and that is one of the reasons it works so fast. One of them I know is comfrey,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a big one. I know that for a fact because anybody can look it up. But comfrey is an ancient name for comfrey is called the bone healer,
Aha. Yeah.
and it gets that name for a reason. But did you said now I know you take the Apollo oil as well, like when you
Well, yeah.
do road trips. Did
I,
you
I,
have
I
that
when
with
I
you?
traveled, especially, I always bring the oil because it helps relax me, and it helps me to sleep. And I have a tough time sleeping sometimes when I'm on the road and traveling. So every little advantage I can take that's going to help me get that rest and get a good night's sleep, because particularly like if I'm leading a tour, I got to be on all day, and for me to do that effectively, I have to have a good night's sleep.
Right.
So I always bring the oil when I travel, and I'm now, after this episode, I'm like, okay, I'm always going to have the salve with me.
This was followed up by an account of one Zacharias of Mytilene, Greece, who wrote in the Syriac Chronicle 9.19 that, quote, the earth with all that is upon it quaked, and the sun began to be darkened by day, and the moon by night, while the ocean was tumultuous with spray from the 24th of March in this year till the 24th of June in the following year. And as the winter in Mesopotamia was a severe one, so much so that the large and unwanted quantity of snow that the birds perished. There was distress among men from these evil things, unquote. So Stothers and Rampino conclude with a quote attributed to John of Ephesus in his Ecclesiastical History by the chronicler of antiquity, Michael de Syrian, in his Chronicle 9.296. There was a sign in the sun, the like of which had never been seen and reported before. The sun became dark, and its darkness lasted for 18 months. Each day it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow. Everyone declared that the sun would never recover its full light. The fruits did not ripen, and the wine tasted like sour grapes, unquote. Now, one of the most provocative quotes I've read regarding this 536 AD event comes from the 6th century Roman senator and scholar Cassiodorus. And this is what he said. But who will not be disturbed and deeply curious about such events if something mysterious and unusual seems to be coming at us from the stars? And that was full name Flavius Magnus Aurelius Cassiodorus, who wrote that in the year 536 AD. This last perspective of Cassiodorus might turn out to be essential in understanding the larger implications and the full spectrum of influences producing the effects that manifested in that decade starting in 546 AD. This paper by Stothers and Rampino was an important milestone in the study of the effects of extreme natural phenomena on cultural history, and especially that of the role of great volcanic eruptions, many of which are exhaustively documented. The entire paper is worth reading, and it can be downloaded from Google Scholar. The full title of the paper is Volcanic Eruptions in the Mediterranean Before AD 630 from Written and Archaeological Sources. It was published in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Volume 88, number B8, on August 10th, 1983. Since the publication of the paper by Stothers and Rampino, many other researchers have weighed in on the mid-6th century crisis. In the journal Climate Change from the year 2001, we find a report authored by 4 dendrochronologists with the Tree Ring Laboratory, Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. The title of this paper is The Rather Unwieldy Spatial Responses to Major Volcanic Events in or About AD 536, 934, and 1258, Frost Rings and Other Dendrochronological Evidence from Mongolia and Northern Siberia. It was published, written by 4 dendrochronologists. Lead author was Rosanna D'Arrigo, and this is what they wrote in their paper. Stothers, now this is Stothers post Stothers and Rampino. He wrote solo articles in 1984 and 1999. He reported historical evidence for dry fog and unusual cold in Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East during AD 536-537, and accounts of plague in these areas in AD 541 through 544. References in Bailey, come back to him in a moment, cited historical documentation of crop failure, famine, and plague in Europe and the Middle East around this time. In AD 536, northern Chinese historical records documented a period of dim sun, summer frosts, loss of crops, severe famine, and widespread population losses. unquote. The reference to Bailey refers to the Irish paleoecologist Mike Bailey, a recognized expert and author in the study of tree rings and their use as a dating tool. He had early access to extensive tree ring chronologies from around the world, and this allowed him to develop a comprehensive view of changes in climate as recorded through this particular medium. As far as the cause of the event, they explain that, quote, Stothers suggested that these extreme environmental conditions were likely due to a major volcanic event, perhaps the tropical eruption of Rabaul, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, New Britain, or possibly a northern latitude eruption. Alternatively, it has been theorized, get this, that a cosmic phenomena, an asteroid or comet, may explain the unusual climate conditions and other effects of this time. Discussing further the work of Mike Bailey from 1994 and 1999, who was probably the first to suggest that some of the evidence was consistent with a cosmic impact event around 536 AD, the authors D'Arrigo and others say that Bailey has extensively reviewed tree ring and other evidence for very unusual conditions in many areas of the globe in the middle 500s. In a multi-millennial Irish oak series, AD 536 was a very narrow ring, but some of the narrowest rings in this record actually occurred in 540 and 541. AD 536 was the second coldest summer in 1,500 years in a temperature record from Fennoscandia, that is from Scandinavia. And there was reduced growth from about AD 536 through AD 545, or even later in this and a number of other European chronologies. A temperature-sensitive tree ring record from North America shows AD 535, 536, and 541 to be the second, third, and fourth coldest years over the past 2 millennia. Subnormal growth was also found in western USA bristlecone pine chronologies. A multi-millennial tree ring record from Chile also shows decreased growth at this time, suggesting that this event impacted parts of the southern hemisphere. So this is very important in establishing that this was a globally propagated signal. It wasn't strictly regional, as has been maintained by some of the researchers in this early on. So in their paper, D'Arrigo, which I'm probably not mispronouncing, and team make reference to a work showing that North America was deeply affected by the onset of the cold. Based upon a temperature-sensitive tree ring record, the years 535, 536, and 541 are respectively, which I already told you were the coldest of the last 2,000 years. So the authors developed a chronology of climate change also affecting Mongolia for the period from AD 262 to 1999. By using relict and living wood from Siberian pine trees, they were able to determine that, quote, the above results for Mongolia are consistent with the observations of summer frosts and snow, crop failures, decreased star visibility, and famine documented for northern China in July and August of 536 and 537. Further indication for a climatic response to this event in Eurasia comes from a cross-section of wood from the Taimyr Peninsula in Siberia. As for Mongolia, there is an abrupt growth decrease in 536, followed by a brief recovery and subsequent decline. Our findings from Mongolia and Taimyr indicate that the spatial impact of this episode extended further eastward into Eurasia than previously documented. So again, what's happening is more and more evidence comes to light, more and more studies are conducted. It's discovering that the imprint, the signal
the fingerprints of this rapid and extreme climate change are indeed being felt worldwide. So jumping forward closer to the present, I'm going to turn now to a paper that was published in 2015. This valuable and interesting paper was authored by Neil Price and Bo Graslund, and it appeared in the book Archaeology, Geomythology, and Climate Events, Past Vulnerability, Volcanic Eruptions, and Human Vulnerability in Traditional Societies, Past and Present. That was the title plus the subtitle. The title of their chapter in this book, Chapter 6, was Excavating the Fimblewinter, Archaeology, Geomythology, and Climate Events of AD 536. The book was published by the Aarhus University Press, and it represents an outstanding example of geomythology. Now, geomythology is nothing less than the recognition that the testimony of our ancient ancestors can be extremely useful in complementing and elucidating scientifically derived data from modern proxies. So Price and Graslund begin their paper by saying this, quote, "There is now general agreement among geoscientists that in the year 536, and for varying lengths of time thereafter, several parts of the world experienced a prolonged solar darkness. This took the form of a loosely termed dust veil, blocking the sun's warmth from reaching the earth, traceable in numerous environmental proxies. Various causes have been put forward, including atmospheric debris from a volcanic eruption or the impacts of comets and or meteorites. While no consensus has been reached, there is substantial support for the eruption of Ilopango volcano in El Salvador as a primary factor. In the next episode, we will look at that in more detail as a primary factor in driving this remarkable climatic excursion. It has also been persuasively argued that the 536 event may have been a combination of different events and causes occurring within a relatively short space of time in different locations. I lean towards some variant of that explanation. So the authors of this paper provide useful insight into the work of Stothers and Rampino. And I'll quote on their comments regarding the work of Stothers and Rampino. In the light of their discoveries, Stothers and Rampino felt justified in connecting the written sources with a significant layer of sulfuric acid that appears in the Greenland ice cores from around the year 540, which might have resulted from an event that occurred some years earlier. Later investigations of major deposits of sulfates in the ice of both Antarctica and Greenland have confirmed that sulfuric aerosols were circulating in the stratosphere over the entire globe for several years after 536, unquote. It turns out that the written sources and the written historical sources, and the proxy evidence do complement each other quite agreeably. The authors continue. As the aerosol studies were ongoing, scientists were also collecting fossil tree ring data from around the northern hemisphere, which appeared to indicate a series of unusually cool summers during the period from 536 to 545, in places even until AD 550. In eastern Siberia and northern Sweden, the average summer temperature has been estimated to have dropped by 3 to 4 degrees centigrade, a dramatic worsening of the climate. Taken together, the evidence was conclusive. The mystery cloud of AD 536 was not only real, but one of the most severe natural disasters to have occurred over the last 2 millennia. In the Mediterranean world, normal levels of light and heat were not to return for at least 18 months.
In other regions, especially further north, the physical effects seem to have been more severe, combining with other environmental factors to cause misery for up to a decade or more in some places. But what was it that had happened? They ask. Well, they then proceed to present a likely answer to the so-called mystery cloud. Quote, "It is clear that something was blocking the rays of the sun, a form of atmospheric disturbance that can only have resulted from the projection of material from the Earth's surface up into the stratosphere. Upon the recognition of its existence, what scientists have since termed the dust veil was almost immediately identified as the result of a volcanic eruption, formed by the sulfates and other ejecta thrown out by an explosion of unusual magnitude." Unquote. I would only add that it would be premature to reject evidence for a projection of material from outside the Earth's atmosphere as well as from the Earth itself. The authors do go on to say that there has accrued evidence that, quote, "there were in fact two clearly separate periods of severe climate downturn. The first in 536 and the second in 540 to 542. This is important for several reasons. Firstly, in raising the possibility that the dust veil event actually had multiple episodes of varying nature, occurring perhaps in different parts of the world within a relatively short period of time. Secondly, this apparent diversion in the data also prompted an alternative explanation, postulating that the dust veil derived not from a volcanic eruption, but instead from one or more extraterrestrial impacts of either comet fragments and or meteorites." Unquote. Well, I would submit that it may not be a case of either volcanism or extraterrestrial impact at work here, but more on that later. I will continue with a report from 2021 that appeared in the Swedish archaeological journal in Situ Archaeologica with the title 536 Dust Veil Event and the Long 6th Century. It was authored by Lars Erik Yerpe with the Kulturhistorisk Museum in Oslo, Sweden. From this report, which provides some background to research into this period, we learned that, quote, "In the early 1980s, an atmospheric anomaly, the dry fog, back up. In the early 1980s, we learned that there was a dry fog in the Mediterranean, AD 536 through 541, and it gained attention from Richard Stothers and Michael Rampino's paper. Their influential study, and I'm quoting now, their influential study demonstrated that the fog caused a cold period and subsequent crop failure and hunger. In the 1990s, a few archaeologists highlighted the impact the event had on at least some aspects of Scandinavian societies. This represented a radical break with the main tendencies in archaeological research of the 1980s. I'm going to read that again. This represented a radical break with the main tendencies in archaeological research of the 1990s, when human agency was considered as the exclusive driving force for societal change. The breakthrough of what was dubbed the Dust Veil event came when Bo Gräslund in 2008, who we've just quoted, suggested that 2 years with low temperatures and lack of sunlight represented the reality behind the Fimblewinter myth. And here you can see In Situ Archaeologica for 2021, volume 15. So I will mention that the myth of the Fimblewinter, or mighty winter, has its origins in the poetic Edda, which dates back to the 13th century. The Norwegian science-oriented website ulukaien.org explains that Fimblewinter is a mythological concept that depicts a cataclysmic period of time. It is described as a grim and terrifying phase in Norse mythology, consisting of 3 successive winters devoid of any intervening summer. During Fimblewinter, the world is gripped by an unyielding cold, and snow descends upon the earth from all directions, covering the land in a thick layer of frost and ice. The once lively landscape transforms into desolate and inhospitable realms. Unquote. Now, the online journal ScienceNorway.no describes work pertaining to the Fimblewinter myth and its possible connection with the 536 AD event. So this account begins by stating, quote, "The long, harsh Fimblewinter is not a myth. Half of Norway and Sweden's population may have died. Researchers now know more and more about the catastrophic year of 536. In recent years, researchers in Norway and Sweden have found increasingly clear evidence of a disaster that struck the planet 1,500 years ago. The disaster must have hit Norwegians and Swedes extremely hard as the Black Death. The same may have happened in the Baltics, Poland, and northern Germany." Unquote. So circling back to researcher Europe, he makes a point I consider to be critically important with respect to present-day social policy and planetary change. And I quote, "Resilient societies handle stress and crisis by changing and adapting to new conditions or simply by absorbing the shock." Resilient societies, this is the key here. Resilient societies, they either adapt to new conditions or they absorb the shock. Therefore, at least 2 distinct forms of societal resilience may be identified. Adaptive resilience is the ability of a society to successfully avoid crossing into an undesirable system regime, or to succeed in crossing back into a desirable one after a disaster. Having established that disaster is a social phenomena as much as a result of societal, political, economic, and cultural qualities of the stricken society as of the cause itself, it is then necessary to understand the society hit by the dust veil event. Unquote. So to clarify the implications here, the key concept is adaptive resilience. I've been making the argument for years that the status of present-day American society is woefully lacking in adaptive resilience due to the incapacitating presence of a bloated, bureaucratic, top-heavy, parasitical, sociopolitical structure devouring the lifeblood of our nation. By ignoring the reality of catastrophic natural climate and environmental change with an exclusive focus on the anthropogenic contribution subordinated to a political agenda, which is what we have had going on for more than 3 decades now, we leave ourselves vulnerable to the inevitable natural shifts that are now so copiously documented from the historical records and the archives of natural changes which I must emphasize, natural changes for which we are not prepared. So I'm going to divert for a moment and quote myself from something I wrote at least a year ago. And this is what I wrote in one of my newsletters, I believe it was.
It is past time to take an axe to the overstuffed colossus embedded in Washington, D.C. With only a few exceptions, firsthand experience has demonstrated repeatedly that smaller, dispersed, independent local and regional associations are far more effective at responding to disasters and emergencies than the sluggish federal bureaucracy shackled with excess rules, regulations, restrictions, procedures, control issues, and incompetence. We recently witnessed the consequence of this bureaucratic overkill in October 2024 with the catastrophic floods in western North Carolina. The slow reaction times and outright obstructionism of FEMA, while local and private groups quickly mobilized and went into action. The havoc in North Carolina still prevails. People are still struggling to subsist as federal disaster relief money is bogged down in a morass of regulatory quicksand. Here's the thing to think about. How much could the ability of North Carolina, or any state for that matter, to respond to disasters improve if the state had more resources at its disposal? This is an important and timely question to ask. Well, is the answer to that, I think the knee-jerk answer to that is if more resources are needed, then it's up to the federal government to step up and provide those resources. Well, I beg to differ from that. Think about this. Given that the federal government extracts in the ballpark of $122 billion in cumulative taxes each and every year just from North Carolina, one can only speculate what would transpire if a substantial portion of that revenue stayed home for North Carolinians to invest in policies and programs that served their needs most effectively. We also saw that what happened in North Carolina was like a replay of what happened in the aftermath of Katrina in New Orleans. Characterized primarily by bureaucratic inertia. Where this evolving knowledge of natural disasters in history is leading to ultimately remains to be seen. But in the meantime, it is giving us new eyes with which to perceive a deeper meaning in the inherited legacy of our past. An unexpected hint of this correlation can't help but grab our attention. The period from 536 to 544 AD, which we now understand to be a time of desolation and devastation, a time of social and natural stagnation, was precisely the time in legend that the Knights of the Round Table set out across the wasteland on the quest to find the supreme healing antidote to the decline of both king and nature, symbolized through the vast corpus of enigmatic and compelling literature of the High Middle Ages, known as the Grail romances, and therein represented as the ultimate object of salvation, the Holy Grail. It was through the agency of the Grail that the healing and restoration of both the king and the wasteland would be accomplished. So it appears that, once again, the wisdom of our ancestors, preserved and transmitted to our own time as myth, has as its basis real phenomena that profoundly affected those people of long ago. There are so many rich and valuable lessons to be gleaned from this Fimblewinter event of almost 1,500 years ago that I will be obliged to present part 2 in order to do justice to this remarkable story and to demonstrate its possible connections with the legend of the quest for the Holy Grail. Finally, I would submit that this juxtaposition that we're seeing more and more of myth, legend, and scientific validation is not a coincidence. But if it's not a coincidence, what is it? Well, what it is that we are now recognizing that there is a legacy of wisdom and knowledge that we have inherited from
the past. And it is now up to us to understand and recognize the value of this information and to begin to study that information in a way that is warranted and is worthy of that legacy that we've inherited. So I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Squaring the Circle. I hope you've enjoyed this first introduction to this extraordinary inflection point within the, if you want to call it, Piscean age of the last 2,000 years. And what we will explore going forward is what are the ramifications down through the centuries for our own time. All right. Thank you again. And I'll see you on the next episode of Squaring the Circle podcast.